Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Of course, the shutdown continues. What is it, day 34, if I've counted correctly, and I may be off a day or two, but that's close enough. Longest shutdown in the history of the federal government, and some breakage perhaps on both sides. First of all, a couple of days ago, we were talking about how President Donald Trump was going to look for an alternative venue for the State of the Union address, which would normally take place next week, and now I think definitely will not. He has finally decided to go along with the letter that Nancy Pelosi has posted, and that is the end of that discussion, at least for the moment. And so if that's seen as a concession to help Nancy Pelosi look good, then so be it. Of course, you have concessions on the other hand, which I'm going to get to in just a minute. Some relatively well-known Democrats, some fairly prominent like Steny Hoyer, some maybe not as well-known like Colin Peterson, are saying, give him the money. Let's stop this insanity. And so some breaks in the rank of the Democratic Party. And I'm not the only one noticing that. If you've looked at some of these more liberal websites, don't recommend it all the time, but necessarily there was one just posted. Matter of fact, I think the Drudge Report has a link to one of them, so you can go right there. That's where someone was saying this was a pretty shrewd strategy, because before it's all through, Donald Trump may break up some of the coalition that, at least for now, has stood behind Nancy Pelosi. Why is it that Donald Trump gave up on the idea of trying to have a State of the Union address? Because he was pretty much convinced by, at least his advisors, I suspect, that Nancy Pelosi will make sure that every Democrat votes against any attempt to bring you to the State of the Union address, and that will be the end of that. But at the same time, there's some breaks within the ranks. Can we resolve this? Well, one of the articles I've posted, it's the third article, I've left the first two articles for the next hour, is written by Guy Benson. And Guy Benson is obviously not a fan of the president, and as you will gather, probably not a big fan of Nancy Pelosi either, but nevertheless had outlined about a week ago a proposal under which both political parties, he says, could claim some kind of victory. It would be a measured one, but in most negotiations, if both parties walk away a little bit discouraged but generally pleased, that's a good negotiation. Nobody comes away with everything, and so that was his idea of how to, in a way, create a sense in which both political parties would have a victory, they would reopen the government, and we'd still have money for border security. So he, of course, said that when he wrote this, day 33, my advice has not been heeded, not that he expected it would be anyway. But he says the good news is both congressional chambers are currently moving legislation designed to end this historic impasse. The bad news is that none of these items being debated at the moment have any realistic chance of becoming law. And that is, again, since it is Thursday, on January 24th, you have two particular bills being considered right now before the United States Senate. And I haven't looked to see whether both of them have been defeated, but they will be. But let me just give you the sense. There's one bill that is actually opening the government, establishing the concurrent resolution for 1/4 of the federal government, and allocates $5.7 billion for a border wall. Okay, that one won't go anywhere. And then you have another one, which is what's called a clean concurrent resolution, which was passed by the House the other day, and this would reopen the government agencies at least until February 8th, which is like nothing. We can figure out that's only a few weeks from now, but nevertheless, they're both procedural votes. And let's just remind ourselves that something that is going to be considered in the Senate has to still pass cloture votes, in other words, to prevent a filibuster. And so that 60-vote threshold probably is not going to be reached on either of those. And I haven't checked to see whether my prediction has already come to pass. That's not the point. The point is that it at least was a movement, even if it was a movement that was destined to failure. Mitch McConnell, as he says, will therefore preside over an exercise in illustrating what cannot emerge from the Senate, while reframing the debate to underscore the truth that as much as they talk about the vital and urgent importance of getting federal workers paid, the top priority for Democrats seem to be elsewhere. He says, I mentioned earlier in the week, the president's constructive offer to Democrats was a reasonable move and a smart political play. The opposition party is finally starting to feel some pressure over their knee-jerk reaction and resistance, which doesn't measure up with their rhetoric. While Speaker Pelosi remains resolute in don't give an inch camp, some rank-and-file members are either decrying this knee-jerk partisanship or urging their own party to give the president the barrier money he's asked for in order to end the ongoing showdown. And that's where we come now to some of the comments made by Representative Colin Peterson. He is a Democrat from Minnesota. I know we have listeners in Minnesota right now, so I thought I would have a shout-out to a Democrat who basically said, I've got the tweet here, but let me give you the full statement. Full statement was, again, from Colin Peterson, Democrat from Minnesota. Give Trump the money. I'd give him the whole thing and put strings on it so that you make sure he puts the wall where it needs to be. Why are we fighting over this? We're going to build that wall anyway at some time, and even suggested that a portion of the money could be used to help the Border Patrol to improve security measures at ports of entry. Now, the likelihood of Nancy Pelosi, as he says, caving in at this stage is virtually nil. So he says, once again, assess the situation with an eye towards getting a yes, even if the Democratic leader has nothing to realistically achieve that goal. He says, to that end, I have a fresh thought, and that is President Trump has already done his part, put DACA, that's the, again, Deferred Action on Childhood Kids, and the TPS extensions along the lines of Dick Durbin bill. In other words, what he proposed isn't all that different than what Senator Dick Durbin out of Illinois has proposed. Okay. And then these are meaningful concessions, even if Democrats don't think the specifics are attractive enough to win their support. These two issues have now been publicly and formally interjected into the discussion by the president. Trump has already climbed down from his previous request for the wall on the dollar amount to the extent of the barrier, or even on the type of the barrier. So he's certainly done something that looks like a concession. So now he comes to the other point. Now it's Nancy Pelosi's turn. What would be required of her under this scenario is to put a counteroffer on the table, including some significant amount of money that's tentatively earmarked for new border barriers, which do work and are needed, according to the experts and all sorts of other individuals. And then this concession could come with a caveat. The Democrats will not negotiate any further details or pass any bill based on the contours of the potential immigration agreement until after the immediate passage of a continuing resolution funding all 7 shuttered agencies for 3 to 4 weeks. Republicans would have to agree to reopen the government on the front end and get everyone paid, even if temporarily, in order for these negotiations to begin. So that's kind of, here's what the president has done, here's what Nancy Pelosi can do, and then I want to come back and just finish off that piece, which again is on our website, in case you'd like to read it in its entirety. Is that a fair compromise? And more importantly, now that we've passed 30 days, there is an implication that some of this could be used to actually thin out the federal bureaucracy. Was that possibly one idea floated in the Trump administration? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
I believe the latest government shutdown has been a fiscal preview of financial problems that will hit the government and us in the next few years. I'm not the only one saying this. Kevin Williamson, in a recent column, says the shutdown could be a dress rehearsal for a fiscal Armageddon. Each day we see news reports of government bureaucrats who've had to scale back their spending because they aren't receiving a paycheck. There was even one story about a couple that took back their Christmas presents. But we all know that when the shutdown is over, government employees will receive back pay. These news reports are focusing on what happens when thousands of federal workers don't get their paychecks. Imagine what our society would look like when millions of citizens stop getting checks because the government has run out of money. We aren't there yet, but we're headed there quickly. Total spending on the major entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, will eventually exceed all the federal tax revenue collected each year, and at the same time, the national debt continues to grow. And as interest rates increase, the cost of servicing the debt will go up even if the national debt did not increase. In the best of all worlds, we would hope that our newly elected members of Congress would be willing to address this growing fiscal crisis. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the slightest interest from congressional leaders to reform our long-term fiscal issues. It's easier to ignore the potential problem or postpone any meaningful reform. The next time you see a story about federal workers not getting paychecks, look at the frustration on their faces and multiply it tenfold in order to see what will happen when grandma doesn't get her Social Security check or an impoverished mother doesn't get her welfare payment. That will be a social and economic crisis we have never seen in our lifetimes. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From SkyPass Entertainment, The Least of These, The Graham Staines Story. The Least of These, rated PG-13, in theaters February 1st. TheLeastOfThese.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Love to hear from any of you that either are affected by the shutdown, either directly or indirectly. And I want to come back and talk about whether this idea by Guy Benson is a reasonable possibility or proposal. And it came home to me last night. I don't spend a lot of time talking about my own life because I want you to think about your own and how these principles apply to yours. But I thought I would use an illustration. I'm a deacon at our church, and the chairman of our deacon, Jack Graham pointed out, doesn't have a job because he actually works as an air traffic controller. Now, he is not one of the controllers. He's actually managing the controllers. So in a sense, I don't even know that he's going to work. Now, some of his colleagues, they are air traffic controllers. And if you're traveling right now, wouldn't you like an air traffic controller to get paid? I mean, think about this. If I, even for a microsecond, and I'm an air traffic controller, have my mind wander a little bit and start thinking about how I'm going to pay my next bills when I'm supposed to be watching planes, that's not good. So this needs to be resolved. And we had some examples. Somebody in the other campus is an FBI agent. He's not working. And so we all, if we don't have somebody in our immediate family know somebody that's not working, certainly we probably know somebody that is in our church that is not. And so this is why I think Guy Benson's proposal makes some sense. And let's give credit where credit is due. There are times when we're very critical of this president, but he's put quite a bit on the table. Matter of fact, so much that some conservatives are upset with him. But the fact is that he has been willing to negotiate on the dollar amount, the extent of the barrier, and the type of the barrier, even put DACA on the table, as well as TPS extensions. We can go into all the details, but that is almost immaterial. what compromise have we seen on the other side? And so this is why Guy Benson said, okay, Nancy Pelosi, and if not you, maybe Steny Hoyer, who is the majority leader there in the House, somebody step forward with a proposal. And so he says, this is, I think, a fair compromise. On one side, Trump would have an assurance demonstrated in a public offer that he'd get a substantial additional dollars for physical barriers. He'd also have continued leverage of another looming partial shutdown in a few weeks' time if Democrats end up refusing to talk in good faith. Reopening the balance of the government for the rest of the year, with the exception of the Department of Homeland Security, might tempt Democrats to tell Trump to go pound sand after he's walked away from this leverage. The specter of a double-dip shutdown over the exact same issue serves as a serious backstop to prevent the sort of bait and switch that many conservatives oftentimes fear, because we've seen this before, haven't we? Yes, we have. Go all the way back to 1986, and I can give you many examples since then. On the other side of the aisle, Democrats would stick by their pledge not to negotiate the border security package while the government remains partially closed, and the workers, whom they hold up as their overwhelming priority, would get their paychecks flowing again as policy details are hammered out over the ensuing weeks. If the Democratic talking points about caring immensely about federal workers' financial well-being and supporting border security are true, this outcome would create some breathing room to craft an acceptable bill while people are still getting paid. If they try to pull the rug out from under Donald Trump, well, he'll be right back where he started within a month. Finally, it's inevitable that elements of each party's base would be unhappy with the resolution. Trump would not be guaranteed his full funding request. The Democrats would have accommodated a key presidential demand as a prerequisite for the temporary reopening of 7 closed agencies. But compromises never please everyone. That's the sort of point. Is anyone actually interested in solving this problem, or is the goal total partisan victory? I think it's a good idea, and that's why I made it our third article on the website today, and you can read it its entirety. I read most of it, but I skipped a few things just because he does get into the weeds, or what we sometimes say, inside baseball, where those of us that are kind of policy geeks figure it out, but the rest might go, what? And so, again, the article there by Guy Benson, it is there for you to read, to maybe post, start some conversation, and you might even post it and say, here's a concrete way in which Democrats and Republicans could work together. We could open the government. Both sides wouldn't get everything they want, but everybody would come away with a political victory, at least a partial victory, and we would actually begin to move past this impasse on day 34. Before we take another break, though, I wanted to bring to you a piece that we, I think, posted the other day, but never talked about. And I bring it up because it is based on an anonymous op-ed that appeared in the Daily Caller. Now, the Daily Caller isn't the Washington Post, but this op-ed piece that comes from a senior Trump official, I think deserves some attention. One, because when we, a while back, talked about another senior official in the Trump administration that was critical of Donald Trump, Washington Post ran with it. This one, which is maybe more supportive, was ignored by the mainstream press, and you need to know about it because this article, written by a writer who's a senior official in the Trump administration, whose identity is known to the Daily Caller, and whose career would be jeopardized by its disclosure, writes that in some respects, this whole shutdown is a way, he says, I assume it's a he, we'll say he, we don't know, it could be a she, but let's just say he, just make it simple, that he believes smokes out the resistance, and that's the title of it. And so it's kind of interesting to recognize that even recently in the Washington Post, various administration officials, such as the chief of staff, Mark Maloney, as well as the budget director, Russell Vogt, are among a number of conservatives who have said that they see this shutdown as a way to begin to reduce the size and scope of the federal government. And I've always wondered about this. And after an individual has not been paid for more than 30 days, I believe, and we've passed that now, it is possible that they don't have to be called back to work. Don't know all the details of that and don't want to even, again, get into the deep weeds. But the point that I'm making here is that there are individuals who say that maybe this is a way, and I'm using their phrase, to shutter government agencies to lock the doors, sell the furniture, and cut them down. That's pretty strong stuff. And the writer said that the shutdown is more than a battle over the wall. It's an opportunity to strip wasteful government agencies for good. In other words, now that those individuals who are been sent home, and many of them are seen as non-essential personnel, could there be an opportunity to have some of them simply never come back? Maybe you'll give them their severance pay, but that will be the end of that for particular agencies. Now, again, I don't say this with any great glee or desire. I do know people that work in federal agencies in everything from the CIA all the way to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I know that most of the people I know are hardworking individuals, and they do what they're told, and they are very competent. But I do know as well, having lived in Washington, D.C., going to Georgetown University, back then it was possible to literally walk through bureaucracies. Now they're tighter than a drum. So it's really tough unless you've got some opportunity. But I remember walking down, in one case, turning in a federal loan application because I was a graduate student, and looking and seeing people asleep on their desk, playing, back then, I guess it was Pong on their computers. A number of desks that were just empty. You'd see people out smoking or just chatting in their break room. There was no sense of activity. It hardly looked like a UPS area or a Federal Express area or an Amazon area or something like that, where you see people moving all the time and nobody's taking a break to do much of anything. And so this is why some people have said there are individuals, even to this day in the federal government, that are getting paid very well, and it is hard to figure out what they do. Dr. Merrill Matthews will be with us tomorrow, and he's told story after story to me off the air, so I guess I can repeat a few of them on the air, of individuals he knows that when he goes to see them in a federal bureaucracy, and he'll say, "Who's in that desk over there?" He says, "I don't know. He hardly ever comes in here. We really don't know what he does. I don't know where he fits on the organizational chart, and nobody is even sure why he's here." Well, that would not happen too often in your company, your business, and it happens, unfortunately, too often in the government. And so this might be a way in which you might be able, as this article points out, to begin to shutter some of these government agencies, to lock the doors, sell the furniture, and cut some of them down to size. And so, if nothing else, what he says is billions upon billions of hard-earned tax dollars are still being dumped into foreign aid programs every year that do nothing for America's interest or national security. He talks about all sorts of kinds of abuse, that there are actually employees that are actually saboteurs of the government policy. And so it does seem to me that there may be some method behind the madness. And that article that appeared recently in the Daily Caller suggests that not everybody's too upset about the shutdown. Might be able to limit the size and scope of government. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We've talked about the shutdown. Love to hear from any of you that perhaps are affected either directly or indirectly by the shutdown. If your spouse or you are actually listening to this program right now and are affected by the shutdown, I'd love to hear from you. If you have a friend, neighbor, coworker, in my case, the chairman of our elder board affected by it, love to get your comments and your thoughts. And I want to focus now on another article. The third article we posted, I mentioned, is on ending the shutdown. The fourth article I want to talk about in terms of how so many of the media reports this week are anti-Christian, and that comes from Representative Dan Crenshaw. But let me just give you kind of a program note starting at the next hour. About a half an hour from now, we're going to get into two stories by David French. He was supposed to join us but had to postpone. But we'll still focus on both of his columns. It's a twofer this time because he's written so many good things. One on the Covington Catholic story, and that is how he thinks that's a real sequel, if you will, to the Kavanaugh case. And then on a Supreme Court gun rights case, because Supreme Court did take a case out of New York related to the Second Amendment. It's kind of a strange one to take, and he explains why, and that will get us into some of the Second Amendment conversation. But I've postponed both of those two articles that are in the first 1 and 2 on our list at the pointofview.net website till the next hour. But you want to jump down to the fourth article, and this one relates to a tweet that came out from Representative Dan Crenshaw. He represents the 2nd Congressional District in Texas. 1st Congressional District is Louis Gohmert. 2nd Congressional District now is Dan Crenshaw. Ted Poe used to be in that district. And eventually we'll just say his name and you'll know who he is. But sometimes the way to get some ability for people to know who we're talking about, he was the one that you might remember that Pete Davidson on Saturday Night Live made fun of because he wears an eye patch. He was a Navy SEAL. And I think he was born actually in Scotland, but nevertheless grew up in Katy, Texas, and represents, of course, the 2nd Congressional District. And eventually I'm hoping that we'll just know him for Dan Crenshaw rather than the guy that wears the eye patch that was made fun of on Saturday Night Live. Just like, it used to be we identified Alexia Ocasio-Cortez as the individual that defeated the incoming or the incumbent representative in New York. Now we all know who she is. I'm hoping eventually we can just say Representative Dan Crenshaw and everybody knows who he is. But nevertheless, he is creating quite a stir, just as Alexia Ocasio-Cortez is making a stir, because he's just unafraid to mix it up. Now, that shouldn't surprise you. He's a Navy SEAL. He doesn't really shy away from conflict. If he hears a gunfight of any sort, he's running to it, not away from it. So he's that kind of individual. And he has been willing to go on CNN sometimes and really mix it up with individuals. And so one of the pictures we have that you can see him on State of the Union there, so that they had him listed as 3 new members of the most diverse Congress of ever. Yeah, you got a Navy SEAL here. A little different than some of the others. But nevertheless, he is still an individual that will be very intense in his comments. But they also talk about in this article how he's willing to shake hands. But let's take his tweet. He called this Media Blunders This Week. Number 1, hardly any coverage of the March for Life. Number 2, BuzzFeed lies about the Cohen case. Number 3, slandering Covington Catholic students over false narrative. Number 4, slandering Karen Pence for working at Christian school. And he says 3 out of 4 are fundamentally anti-Christian just in the last 7 days. So, again, let's, as this particular article goes into, this article that, again, comes from Red State, takes each one of those 4 real carefully and goes into more detail. Number 1, hardly any coverage of the March for Life. Yes, this is one, again, something that the pro-life movement is used to seeing or not seeing. No matter how big their marches are, unless the coverage is to smear participants, it stands in stark contrast This article says, to the fawning round-the-clock coverage we see every year, the various feminist marches on D.C. to celebrate the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision legalizing abortion. So point number one, check, yes, hardly any coverage of the March for Life. Number two, BuzzFeed lies about the Cohen case, and this actually goes to a quote that is in Politico, which is a little more left-leaning, but again, a reminder that special counsel's Robert Mueller's office was denying aspects of the blockbuster BuzzFeed news report that President Donald Trump instructed his former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, to lie to Congress about dealings related to a Trump Tower Moscow project under consideration during the 2016 presidential election. And then it goes on to say in this article, Mueller's normally tight-lipped operation issued a statement, this was last Friday, indicating that the BuzzFeed report contained inaccuracies, at least with respect to statements about the information gathered by the special counsel's team. BuzzFeed's description of specific statements to the special counsel's office, this individual said, and characterization of documents and testimony obtained by this office regarding Michael Cohen's congressional testimony are not accurate. So, again, that was the second one. And again, BuzzFeed lies about Cohen case, check. Number three, slandering Covington Catholic students over false narrative. This one's a relatively short one because we'll actually spend some more time in the next hour talking about that. But I think it's been documented pretty well that the media rushed to judgment and basically arguing that this one student with a Make America Great hat, as well as some of the other students, were actually, in a sense, confronting this Native American and smirking and being disrespectful and saying inappropriate things, when now, as more and more data has been collected, more iPhone audio and video has been collected, we recognize, if anything, it was just the other way around. And so, of course, there you find that particular article. And again, the slandering of these Catholic students over false narrative, check. Then third, and fourth, I should say, and final, slandering Karen Pence for working at a Christian school. And here, interesting enough, they quoted David French, who, of course, we're going to quote pretty extensively in the next hour. He said, the intolerance directed at Karen Pence for working for a church ministry that expresses the Orthodox Christian view of human sexuality is deeply troubling. A Christian working for a Christian ministry is not a scandal. And, of course, you've seen that as well. A CNN writer described the school's conduct code as, this language is disgusting. Another one was outraged that she could be working at a school that discriminated against LGBT adults and children. And one commentary even suggested the school is like a real-life setting for The Handmaid's Tale. And if you want all those quotes, they're in my Monday commentary coming out January 28th, in which I go into that in some detail. But again, the point that is made here is that it's the bigger issue is how ruthlessly the mainstream and progressive media types went after her. In fact, the same media types go haywire when conservatives called out the anti-Semitic Rashida Tlaib or Ileana Omar, which you are actually individuals that have made some pretty anti-Semitic comments, and critics have said we should not be attacking their faith. No, but we are attacking or criticizing, I think would be a better word, their anti-Semitic ideas. And so, again, attacking the faith, this article says, of elected Democrats who want to eradicate Jews is off limits. But the media and leftists taking nasty, bigoted swipes at the second lady for working at a Christian school, well, that's okay. So finally, he says 3 out of 4 are fundamentally anti-Christian. Just the last 7 days, check. So if nothing else, you got to love Dan Crenshaw. I want to see if we can get him on sometime soon, but he's actually become quite a media star because he is willing to go into just about any forum for conversation and debate and discussion. And if you aren't familiar with what he looks like, the picture there actually was taken when he was on State of the Union before he was elected, before he was sworn in. He was elected, but before he was sworn in. Since then, he's been mixing it up with everybody, including Pete Davidson. If you might remember, Pete Davidson made some kind of snarky comments about him, and instead of being sad about it. Actually was willing to go on Saturday Night Live with Pete Davidson and have kind of a back and forth on that. It's pretty good stuff. So this is an individual that I am so thrilled has been elected to the 2nd Congressional District in the state of Texas. We're going to be hearing a lot more from him. And if you'd like to read the piece in which he really makes a number of very powerful statements, the conclusion, I think, is enough. 3 out of 4 are fundamentally anti-Christian news stories. The only one that wasn't was the BuzzFeed story. All the others illustrate a real hostility sometimes towards Christians in the media. We shouldn't be surprised. Let's take a break. We'll come back and focus on one more issue before the top of the hour. That coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. An editorial penned in the Tampa Bay Times has called for one of our clients to form a league of their own. The author writes about Cambridge Christian School, who earned the chance to play for a state football championship game against another Christian school. Both teams asked the Florida High School Athletic Association to pray over the public address system prior to kickoff. That request was denied by the FHSAA specifically because the requested speech was religious in nature. The author supports the FHSAA. He writes, if Cambridge and similar schools want public community prayer before their state championship games, they should leave the FHSAA and form their own private statewide Christian association and stage their own playoffs. Now, we were once told that if you wanted to pray in school, you should go to a private Christian school. These students did, but now that they are there, this author would have them leave the league entirely. Well, where does it end? Must religious picnickers form their own private parks lest they be accused of violating the Constitution for saying grace over their meal at a public park? It was the FHSAA that engaged in religious discrimination against Cambridge Christian School. It would be an even greater offense to the Constitution's protection of religious liberty to force these students further from public participation. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let me talk about the youth vote for just a minute. And the reason for that is, first of all, we spent some time earlier this week, Nick Pitts in studio, and we had a chance to talk with Jonathan Haidt, the co-author of the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And, of course, then yesterday we had our Millennial Roundtable, Nick Pitts sitting in this chair. But there have been some really interesting articles coming out lately that say that, in this particular case, America's young people are on the verge of a leftist revolution. And I love how Jim Garrity says it again. In other words, he's a little more skeptical about this. And I thought it'd be good for just a minute to provide a little bit of perspective. I think maybe I'll raise this again when maybe I get a chance to join the Millennial Roundtable or the next time Nick Pitts is just sitting across from me, because it's really interesting that you have this article that came out the other day, 538, which, of course, has really been documenting some of these liberal causes. And they had a very lengthy profile of Sean McElwee, I guess is how you say, Sean McElwee, I think is how it's pronounced, and a cadre of young leftist activists whose voices have grown louder in years following Hillary Clinton's loss to Trump. Okay, so the argument is this, that we have all sorts of individuals, especially young people that are in the millennial generation. Now some of the iGen generation are almost old enough to vote. So we're talking about those individuals born after the year 2000 who are now going to change the direction of the country. By the way, I don't necessarily disagree with all of that, but I think we have to add a little bit of perspective to this. And McElwee actually calls himself an Overton window mover. You go, what is an Overton window? That's actually something that comes from one of our conservative friends that's been on the program with us before. It's the sort of the idea, the range of ideas that can be acceptable in public opinion. Some are just outlandish, never going to happen. Some are just ridiculous. And, you know, on the right, it would be that we're going to ban abortion this year. Not going to happen. On the left, it might be we're going to implement, I don't know, let's take the Green New Deal this year. Not going to happen either. But then there are things in the middle, you know, that we might fund a wall or some other things. So that's the idea. And so one of the things that Jim McGarity says, I don't doubt that the article is accurately reported, but I feel that I've read a lot of variations of this young, impassioned idealists of the left are about to transform American politics. And now he gives us a list. And if you don't know, this is probably going to be one of my commentaries, because it's a list that's sort of helpful to remind people we've heard all of this before. He says, for example, I remember reading Students for Obama and the idea that they are young, they're impassioned, they're fluent in social media, they've changed campaigns forever. He says, I can remember when you had the victory in 2006 of Ned Lamont in the Connecticut Democratic Senate primary, which was a watershed moment in that particular case because Joe Lieberman lost. And so Joe Lieberman ran as an independent and beat him. That was the end of that. He says, I remember reading that the Iraq War has generated an explosion of youth activism, that the orange-hatted teen and 20-something volunteers for Howard Dean, remember Howard Dean, in Iowa, were the vanguard of new force in American politics. Or going even further back, this would not be helpful for some of our young people, but for some of us older people, remember that even the election of Bill Clinton in 1992, quote, inspired hopes of a rebirth of a 60s-style political idealism led by young people. And if you're going to go even further back, now we've got to go in the 1980s, Gary Hart's Politics of a New Generation, or even further back, we go to George McGovern in 1972, or let's go all the way back to 1960, John F. Kennedy. The point I'm making is we've heard this before, haven't we? And if you hadn't believed it then, after George McGovern was elected, you, of course, have election of Jimmy Carter that lasted only until Ronald Reagan replaced him. You had, of course, Bill Clinton's election in 1992, re-election in 1996, but then George W. Bush. And, of course, this idea, Students for Obama, well, that's the end of that. There's no way somebody like Donald Trump can win. I think he's president right now. So the point he's making is that these attempts to say that the youth vote will transform America haven't worked out quite so much. He then goes on, and I appreciate him saying this as well. This is not to say that the Republican Party's problems with the millennials and Generation Z aren't real and serious. He says that there are some real issues that certainly need to be raised. But again, he's also saying that when we talk about this so-called Overton window that moves in terms of what is respectable dialogue and what is not, it can move in both directions, both left and right. For example, he says the Iraq War is not the issue it was during the Bush years. Unemployment is lower than during the Great Recession. The Supreme Court ruled on gay marriage. The public loses interest in some issues, like the Tea Party era worries about the deficit and the debt. Some issues both disappear and linger in spirit. He says, like the bailouts of the Troubled Asset Relief Program and General Motors and some of those. But the point is, it's always moving, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to move always to the left. And the example he uses is one I just used a minute ago. For example, you're hearing all sorts of politicians and even elected members of Congress talking about the Green New Deal. And he says that's caught on as a buzzword or a slogan. But he says, I'm not seeing the Democratic 2020 contenders giving any specifics about cutting military spending in half. Because guess what? That's part of the Green New Deal. Most people probably don't even know that. And I think it illustrates again that this attempt to say that the young people are about ready to take over, well, we'll see. And sometimes they generate a great deal of enthusiasm, but still the truth is the younger you are, the less likely you are to be registered to vote. The younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. We'll see how this plays out. And we've seen it before. We'll see what it plays out to be in the 2020 election. I thought I might just mention, though, that we did do this interview on the coddling of the American mind. And since it appeared on the third hour, which is not normally heard on this radio station, any one of these radio stations, I might just mention then that you might want to go back and listen to it because it's really based upon a couple of untruths. One of those untruths is the fact that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Another one is the idea that you should always trust your feelings. And number three, that what we have right now is a battle between good and evil people. And I think those three ideas, which form the foundation of the entire book, help us understand why we see so much turmoil on campus and maybe why you have this no holds barred, take no prisoners kind of mindset, even in Congress right now. So if you haven't had a chance to hear that interview, which took place on Tuesday at 2 o'clock, you can certainly go back and listen to it on our program and on our website, pointofview.net. Let me just mention that today, my commentary today is on the fiscal preview, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later because I've suggested that this government shutdown does give you a preview of what it might look like someday when not only are we not sending checks to 1/4 of the federal employees, but when maybe the government is so broke it can't even send checks to Social Security recipients, can't send money to individuals deserving food stamps. And this is why we need to pay attention to the deficit and the national debt as well. If you haven't already signed your name to our petition to fight against religious persecution, I mentioned that just a few minutes ago. Why are we sending money to countries that hate us, to countries that actually persecute Christians? And so we encourage you to sign our petition. It is available on our website, pointofview.net. Just click on that button that says Fight Against Religious Persecution, and we'll take a break. When we come back, we have a lot to cover from some of the articles by David French. Stay tuned.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Make your next bold move now. Give online at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. It's our future. The time is now. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We've got a lot to cover in this first hour here. We're going to be quoting from two different articles by David French, who, by the way, is supposed to be with us, but then had to reschedule, so we'll see if we'll have him on next week. But one of those is the first article, which I call The Covington Catholic Story, in which he's arguing that what happened to these Catholic kids is a terrible sequel to the Brett Kavanaugh case, and I'll let him explain that as we read his article. And then he also takes on this case that has gone to the Supreme Court about the Second Amendment and gun rights. It's kind of an obscure law that is in the state of New York. It's very draconian and probably does need to be reversed, but why did the Supreme Court decide to take that case? So we'll get into that as well. But just before we do so, let me just mention that the third article we've posted, which I have talked about previously on another hour, reminds us that we do have a vote today in an attempt to end the shutdown. Guy Benson has written a very good piece on how I think you could come up with something that might appeal both to President Trump and his administration and to Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership in the House. That being said, today we're going to have two show votes, none of which are going to go anywhere. You have the vote on what's oftentimes referred to as the Trump bill, which would actually allocate $5.7 billion for a border wall. That obviously will not get the 60 vote requisite in the Senate. But nevertheless, let's give Mitch McConnell credit for scheduling that. And then you're going to have another vote on what is called kind of a clean CR. CR stands for concurrent resolution. And the concurrent resolution is one that actually would fund the government, at least that part of the government which is shut down, which is about a quarter of the government, about 800,000 workers, through February 8th. That one will not pass either, I don't think. But nevertheless, we will see what we have here. And so those actions are taken behind the scenes. And again, there is a need for some kind of clarification and ending of the shutdown. This is, what is it, if I've counted right, day 34, and there are no evidence that it's going to end anytime soon. And a little bit later, we might even open the phones, get some of your comments, because I think most of us know somebody, may not be us, may not be somebody in our immediate family, but it's probably somebody who has been affected by this. The chairman of our deacon board actually works with air traffic control and is not being paid right now. Now, he's not one of the ones that are actually looking at the screens. He's sort of managing them, but again, has been shut down. And just think about this. You know, you have TSA and air traffic controllers and others that aren't getting paid. So this is something that needs to be resolved. I think Guy Benson's piece, which is the third article we've posted here, really gives a solution to how you could come up with a compromise which, candidly, not everybody who supports Donald Trump would like, and a compromise which I'm sure Nancy Pelosi and many Democrats would not like, but a compromise nevertheless so that we can put people back to work. So I have posted that one, and we may get to that a little bit later. But I did want to get to this particular piece by David French, because he says, you know, over the last 72 hours, I've been asking myself a simple question. What would happen if a group of black Israelites had spent an hour taunting my son's high school football team. How would they react if a Native American elder had walked into their midst, apparently not saying anything intelligible to them, but rather banging a drum and chanting inches from one kid's face? Would they have thought that was an effort at peacemaking or just more taunting? Would they have said, what would they have said if some of the people walking with the elder had yelled insults at them? And he says, I ask all those questions because I'm pretty sure I know the answer. The boys wouldn't have reacted all that differently from the kids at Covington Catholic. They would have sung different songs. They would have chanted different chants. Maybe one or two of the kids would have lofted an obscene gesture in the direction of the black Israelites. In other words, they would have been kids. And barring some sort of overt criminal act, the blame for any tension that followed should rest with the adults who behaved so aggressively and, frankly, he says, strangely. Let's face it, he says, walking through a group of boys chanting and banging a drum is not exactly normal behavior. And he also goes on to say that if a kid responded poorly to a challenging situation, you reprimand him, you teach him. But he says, this is America 2019, and it's full of rage and hate. And parents of young men know that hostile people would instead want to destroy your child's life. They would want to destroy your own livelihood. They would wish violence on him and you. They would try to destroy your school. They would mock your faith. And then, even when their rage is proven to be unfounded, they would spend days hunting through your background and your school's history to try to find some reason to hate you anyway. Which is why he comes to a tweet that was posted by MSNBC's Chris Hayes. Chris Hayes, in one of his tweets, said, I haven't seen a broad conservative coalition as fired up about a story since Kavanaugh. Pretty interesting. And so David French says he's exactly right. So long as the Covington Catholic story remains in the news, so long as activists continue to comb through internet archives and social media to try to damn the school, its students, and parents to social justice hell, this story is Brett Kavanaugh, the sequel. And that's why, as it's summed up by a tweet from Bethany Mandel, who says, between the Kavanaugh debacle and now what has happened with these Make America Great boys, there's a lot of nervous boys, moms, and dads out there. If they can and will seek to destroy these guys, they'll come after yours. And the point he's making is in the Kavanaugh case, conservative men and women looked at decades-old, uncorroborated allegations, the unquestioning acceptance of those claims, and the furious attempt to destroy a man's reputation and career, even by passing through the wildest and most implausible claims, and thought, that could be me, or that could be my husband. Now the same people look at the reaction to the Covington Catholic kids and think, that could be my son. And so when we come back, I want to spend some time talking about this because he's really making a connection, which I hadn't really thought about until, first of all, I started seeing some of these tweets and then saw this article by him. We have a kind of guilty unless you can prove your innocence, and even when you try to prove your innocence, that probably shows you're guilty as well. And in the Kavanaugh hearings, you had a little bit of a feeling like, that could be me. That could be my husband. That could be my brother. That could be my uncle. And now with the Covington Catholic kids, you say, that could be my son. That could be my nephew. And, of course, for some time, as we've seen some of the actions against African-American boys, some people say, yeah, it really could be my son who is being roughed up by the police. So I want to come back and talk about this a little bit more. He's seeing some connections that I'd like to talk about. And most importantly, I'd love to hear your comments. Maybe you'd like to talk about them as well. 1-800-351-1212. Talk about the Covington Catholic case. And we're going to get into the gun rights Second Amendment case before the Supreme Court. An interesting law to consider. We'll see why the justices took it. And we'll get into that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
I've believe the latest government shutdown has been a fiscal preview of financial problems that will hit the government and us in the next few years. I'm not the only one saying this. Kevin Williamson, in a recent column, says the shutdown could be a dress rehearsal for a fiscal Armageddon. Each day we see news reports of government bureaucrats who've had to scale back their spending because they aren't receiving a paycheck. There was even one story about a couple that took back their Christmas presents. But we all know that when the shutdown is over, government employees will receive back pay. These news reports are focusing on what happens when thousands of federal workers don't get their paychecks. Imagine what our society would look like when millions of citizens stop getting checks because the government has run out of money. We aren't there yet, but we're headed there quickly. Total spending on the major entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, will eventually exceed all the federal tax revenue collected each year, and at the same time, the national debt continues to grow. And as interest rates increase, the cost of servicing the debt will go up even if the national debt did not increase. In the best of all worlds, we would hope that our newly elected members of Congress would be willing to address this growing fiscal crisis. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the slightest interest from congressional leaders to reform our long-term fiscal issues. It's easier to ignore the potential problem or postpone any meaningful reform. The next time you see a story about federal workers not getting paychecks, look at the frustration on their faces and multiply it tenfold in order to see what will happen when grandma doesn't get her Social Security check or an impoverished mother doesn't get her welfare payment. That will be a social and economic crisis we have never seen in our lifetimes. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From SkyPass Entertainment, The Least of These, The Graham Stain Story. The Least of These, rated PG-13, in theaters February 1st. TheLeastOfThese.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get some calls in just a minute. Let me just, again, make the case that David French made in his piece. He was going to be with us today to make it verbally, but I think he does a very good job of writing it, and I'll do my best to try to represent his idea that in the Kavanaugh case, here's a situation in which you have an individual whose reputation career was essentially almost destroyed because of claims, some of which were pretty wild and unsubstantiated. We now know the rest of the story. Some of those were actually made up. But nevertheless, there was a feeling at the time, that could be me if you're a man. That could be my husband. It could be my brother. That could be all sorts of individuals. And now seeing the reaction to the Covington Catholic kids, who I don't think did anything wrong. Nick Sandman was on an interview the other day, and he seems like such a passive kind of kid to have attributed the kinds of things to him that were attributed to him when he was nervous and smiling kind of awkwardly as a smirk and he was confronting the Indian are completely bizarre in light of now who we know he is, Nick Sandman. And in light of all the things that Nathan Phillips, the Indian, American Indian, has done, you can see what was actually going on. And so anyway, just before I take my first phone call here, what we are talking about is, of course, the Kavanaugh case. He says, you know, you can hold that fear in your heart without exercising or condoning sexual assault in any way. In other words, the idea that, you know, I don't condone sexual assault, but At the same time, I'm wondering if I could be unfairly accused. I think one of our callers wants to talk about that. He says you can also hold that fear in your heart without excusing or condoning racism or any thoughtless taunts. Again, you can look at what happened to Nick Sandman and the Covington Catholic kids and say, I don't excuse racism, but also want to know that I wonder if something like this could happen to me. Because you'll know that for all too many people, the truth doesn't really matter. You're a symbol, not a person. When angry people cook that social justice omelet, they break eggs not with regret, but with angry glee. Great turn of phrase there by David French. He says, yes, I know about the whatabouts. I know the habit of some people on the right to immediately hunt through the past of even dead black men and boys to find some evidence they were a bad person, even if those facts aren't relevant to the case at hand. I've seen the supposedly incriminating pictures of young black men passed around social media as their evidence when they're not. He says, I know about the Central Park Five, because we can go through all those stories. And I also know that practice is horrible. I know it's evil, and I understand why black parents worry that their kids would be nixed and live in fear of something far more deadly than social media shame campaigns or lost jobs. The other day, of course, during Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we talked about this case of Gregory Tucker, young African-American slammed to the ground simply because he had a taillight out and because he decided to drive to a safe place that was well lit, basically his cousin's house, and that was then enough for them to accuse him of resisting arrest, and a case that the Rutherford Institute's taking right now. He's not killed or shot, but you can see the issue there. So again, we recognize these have been issues for some time, but he says the existence of that fear and the reality of these cases doesn't justify in any way a decision to intentionally inflict fear and pain on your political enemies. And when you're found to be wrong, when snap judgments go awry, the proper response is to apologize. He says, as some of my colleagues have done, we're human, we make mistakes. The proper response is not to double down in digging for dirt, hoping and praying that you'll find some reason to justify your initial rage. When activists and partisans do that, they send a clear message to their opponents. They will destroy you if they can. And that's the message that sent a shudder up the spine of husbands and wives during the Kavanaugh hearings. That's the message that sends a shudder up the spines of mom and dads as they watch men and women try to ruin the Covington Catholic kids. This isn't just a media scandal. When we see hate, some of us see our sons, and we know that in America today, their futures, their reputations, and given the prevalence of death threats, perhaps even their very lives are in the hands of an angry mob. It's that concern for our kids that makes Chris Hayes correct. After initial missteps, the right is largely united. There exists out there a level of hate and an eagerness to believe the worst that is not one of us should tolerate and not one of us should visit upon our foes. So I'd love to get your comments if you would like to join the conversation today. He sees a very direct connection between some of the concerns that surfaced in the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and some of the things we've learned since the Covington Catholic kids story. And that is our first article today on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a phone call first, and we'll go to, let's go to New Hampshire. Kay, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. I wanted to share something with you and with the listeners. Over the last 5 years, I've learned I no longer have faith in the American justice system as far as my faith is in God as far as justice goes and righting wrongs. But it seems that when Mrs. Blasey Ford went up to the Congress and she was able to come forward with absolutely no corroborating evidence against Kavanaugh, I was in shock up here where I am because I myself, I am a Christian. I came forward with tons of evidence, videotapes, audio tapes, emails, witnesses, and it ranged the gamut from starting out as a sexual harassment, trying to protect females in hospitals who could be assaulted by this male nursing student. Me and through two other females spoke up. We were hushed up. We were silenced. I was threatened not to come back to the school, so I went to the state. I went to the state level, to the Human Rights Commission. Documents were falsified. There was videotapes and audio tapes of that. went to the Attorney General's office. No one listened. No one cared. And then we went into the court, and the attorney at the government level falsified the document and then perjured herself to the court by saying she never falsified a document, even though the video showed that the document was tampered with and the people were admitting it themselves. From that point forward, I have seen so much obstruction of justice. There's no other word for it. And it all depends, I've learned, if you speak against what appears to be a far-left feminist agenda, and there's people involved to support that far-left feminist agenda, and you come forward with any evidence, they will not only bury the evidence through breaking the law themselves, but they will come after you and slander you horrendously in court pleadings and attack your character, even if you are a female coming forward with evidence to show all of this. I wouldn't have even had to have spoken to anyone. Wow. You could just read the documents. So I wanted to share that because I did go to one of our senators as well and our congressmen, and they did nothing, but they certainly went after Trump and spoke out against Trump and wanting to get all the women together to sign something against him, but they wouldn't help the women in their own state. So
yeah, I think your point's well taken. We're coming to a break here, and I just wanted to get that in because it's just an illustration, again, that justice is not fair. And in some respects, your argument, I think, really makes the case that David French does as well. Let me take another phone call real quickly just before we take a break because, again, these are some issues we've been putting on the table. And a little bit later, I'm going to get into this gun rights case. But John in Arizona, what's on your mind?
Hi, Kirby. Good talking to you. Yeah, I just wanted to get your take and see if you heard about this new abortion bill in New York. It is really, really disgusting. I think it's taken a lot of people by storm. I'm seeing on social media, there's a lot of outrage in this bill, and it's, from what I understand, it passed. And
it did.
It's actually allowing late-term abortion.
Right. And again, if you've been watching the various memes that are out there right now, you will see that they'll even sometimes show a picture of a baby born in at 1:05, could have been aborted at 1:04, p.m. or something like that, illustrating that it is the most liberal and most outrageous of all abortion bills you can possibly even imagine in the state of New York, which then led to applause in the chamber. I just, I remember a long time ago, we used to talk with some people that had been at the initial debates about abortion, said, even if abortion were legal, I figured most people would just not talk about it. They certainly wouldn't chant in the streets, and they wouldn't be applauding in the chamber. And so that is something I was hoping we could talk about tomorrow with Penna Dexter, who will be there as part of our roundtable. Also, Dr. Merrill Matthews, and a little bit later when he gets off the plane, Kelly Shackelford. So we really will get into that in more detail. I kind of postponed it because I always like to have Penna, who brings so much to the table, talking about this abortion decision. And then if the applause is not enough, they even lit up one of the buildings to celebrate its passage. We're killing babies, and we applaud it in the actual legislative chamber. We light up the tower, and I don't think any of us ever thought that it would get to that point. But that's the world that we live in today, even on the issue of abortion. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more cover. We will do so right after this.
Question: do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less, and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, I want to spend some time, if we can, also talking about this other piece by David French. It's kind of a David French hour, but he's written two very good pieces, one on the Covington kids and then one on the whole issue of Second Amendment and a Supreme Court case looking at gun rights once again out of the state of New York. But John, just a minute ago, mentioned to us also this case that I thought we would deal with a little bit more tomorrow. But again, on the 46th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, which took place Tuesday. By the way, I had a commentary on that on Tuesday. That was when the so-called New York Reproductive Health Act was signed by Governor Cuomo. And it is done in part, number one, to actually ensure that even if Roe versus Wade is overturned, which isn't going to happen anytime soon, but let's assume that it is, that then it would still protect, quote, the woman's right to have an abortion. And it's more far-reaching, really, than many people would have imagined. And it just illustrates that even if Roe versus Wade is overturned, we would go back to what happened before 1973, where you had some states that had very liberal abortion laws, like New York and others, and you'd have other states that would have more restrictive laws. So, again, we'll see where that goes. But we'll talk more about its significance tomorrow and maybe post some articles about that, some of the analysis. It took place as kind of, if you will, a celebration of Roe versus Wade. And it just is amazing to me. I remember years ago when we had some individuals that had been on the program with Marlon Maddox, who was the original host, of course, of Point of View, saying they just never really thought that you, even after the Roe versus Wade decision, that you would have women celebrating their abortion, marching in the streets, cheering as they were in the legislative session there as well. Or even now, you've probably seen some of the videos where these abortion-minded women then talk about their abortions with the kids. I just wouldn't have anticipated any of that, but that is the world that we find ourselves in. And maybe the reaction that we're seeing is due to the fact that the younger you are, the more likely you are to be pro-life. So as a result, some of those that are pro-abortion recognize their days might actually be numbered, and maybe even Roe versus Wade's days might be numbered, so we'll see where that takes us. But let me get into one other issue that I wanted to cover before we get into a different topic next hour, and that is David French has written about this case that went to the Supreme Court, and it's a case out of New York City in particular. And to help you understand, it prohibits any person who has a license to own a gun, which, by the way, is very rare in New York City. But even if you have a license to own a gun, you cannot transport that gun, even in a locked container, even if it's separate from its ammunition, anywhere except for one of 7 shooting ranges within the city. So he says, under this law, if you wanted to transport your gun to a shooting competition outside the city, you can't. If you're fortunate enough to own a second home, you can't even take your own weapon to your own home. You can't take it to any other shooting range. If you leave your house for an extended period of time, your gun has to stay in your vacant home. If you're going to another location where you have the right to possess or even carry the gun, the weapon can't travel with you. So, as he says, it's an astonishing law, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere except being defeated, because it's kind of hard to imagine right now that the Supreme Court granted a cert application. It takes 4 to take a case, 5 to win. I doubt that they took this case simply because they wanted to affirm it. But at the same time, you got to recognize there are other cases which the Supreme Court has declined to hear. Those involve weapons bans, assault weapons bans, so-called assault weapons ban in New York and Connecticut. They didn't want to hear an appeal of a Maryland assault weapons ban. They didn't want to hear an appeal of California's 10-day waiting period, and on and on and on. So it's kind of interesting that of the cases they took, this is the one that they took. And so he answers the question briefly, and then has kind of 4 points as to actually what is taking place. And that is, he says, why the step into the arena now? And he says, well, given the originalist turn in the court since Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation, and given his previous gun rights jurisprudence, he says, I sincerely doubt the court granting review to affirm the Second Circuit Court's decision uphold the New York City law. So he says basically the law is on a death march. But then he does something which I thought was really kind of telling. He gives us 4 reasons why they did what they did. Okay, so if you're taking some notes or you're interested in this, or maybe you want to pass this on to your friends or even post this article, it's the second article on our website, pointofview.net. Those of you interested in gun rights, Second Amendment, this would be one that you would want to read in its entirety. But point number 1 is there's a new sheriff in town. He says Occam's razor suggests that the grant is as simple as a change of personnel. That is, while the 4 more originalist justices could have voted to take any of these significant cases before, it's likely there was some doubt or even concern about how Justice Kennedy would rule. The more progressive justices could also have voted to take the cases, but they likely shared the same concerns. Now the jurisprudential lines are more clearly drawn, and the court's originalist bloc is ready to render a decisive Second Amendment decision. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, it's time to set a Second Amendment test, he says. This is the most worrisome option ever since the Heller decision, which came out of Washington, D.C. Litigants have battled over the appropriate level of scrutiny to apply to regulations affecting Second Amendment rights. The highest level of traditional constitutional scrutiny, called strict scrutiny, would mean that gun control laws would tend to fail. Lower levels of scrutiny, like such intermediate scrutiny, actually have generally been applied to lower courts to uphold gun control restrictions, including assault weapons bans and restrictions on large capacity magazines. Are there 5 votes for strict scrutiny? In other words, that would say that the Second Amendment is on the par with the First Amendment, and so as a result, you can't really limit First Amendment free speech except in extraordinary cases. You can't, as you've always heard people say, yell fire in a crowded theater or something like that. But otherwise, when in doubt, you have your First Amendment rights. And he doubts, and I agree, I doubt whether we have enough votes for that. But we'll see. And so maybe there's going to be a test that will come. Not that I'm a fan of that. We've already talked with Kelly Shackelford about other tests, the so-called lemon test on First Amendment. We won't get into that. Third point, he said, it's the text, stupid. He said, if I were to bet on the outcome and reasoning in this case, I'd bet that it follows from straightforward textualism. That is, the Second Amendment rights basically recognize the right to both keep and bear arms. How can you keep arms when you're required to leave them behind in a vacant dwelling when you leave your home? Pretty straightforward, wouldn't you say? A person should be able to keep their weapons in the place where they lay their head. In addition, the right to bear arms implies learning to handle and use them. A person's right to self-defense travels with them, and why few scholars doubt that, a criminal background check is, if nothing else, a constitutionally valid restriction on the right to a handgun carry permit or even the right to hold a gun. The idea that a person can be blocked from transporting their lawfully owned gun to a different location, leaving their lawful means of self-defense behind, means that the words keep and bear arms have no real meaning at all. And then fourth and finally, one step at a time. He says it's possible that plucking low-hanging fruit is one way to begin the long and slow process of creating a truly robust body of gun rights precedent. The cases will build slowly and deliberately, but they have to start somewhere, so why not start with a law that's, well, David French says, why not start with a law that's, well, insane? I love that. Note that some of these motivations can overlap. The new sheriff can want to start slowly, for example, but unless the court does something truly unexpected, like strike down the law by applying an intermediate scrutiny text that actually helps gun controllers, the outcome of the case will be positive for gun rights. The real question is, how positive will it be? So what are your thoughts? This is a particular law that only applies to people in New York City, but it is a law that says you cannot transport your gun, even in a locked container, even when it's separate from its ammunition, anywhere outside of the city, unless you're going to one of 7 shooting ranges within the city. It is amazing to me. It is absolutely amazing to me that, first of all, that law could be passed in New York City, although that's maybe not as amazing as the second point I'm going to make. And because even more amazing to me is that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals upheld it. and it has made its way to the Supreme Court. And then I don't think I'm as surprised that the Supreme Court justices decided to take it, because now they were pretty sure, where they weren't as sure before, what Justice Anthony Kennedy might do. So I'd love to get your thoughts. Maybe any of you are the gun owners, maybe have been watching this case, or just maybe you're hearing about it for the first time. This might be good news for the Second Amendment. We'll have a few months to find out whether it will. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We have a lot more to talk about right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. An editorial penned in the Tampa Bay Times has called for one of our clients to form a league of their own. The author writes about Cambridge Christian School, who earned the chance to play for a state football championship game against another Christian school. Both teams asked the Florida High School Athletic Association to pray over the public address system prior to kickoff. That request was denied by the FHSAA, specifically because the requested speech was religious in nature. The author supports the FHSAA. He writes, if Cambridge and similar schools want public community prayer before their state championship games, they should leave the FHSAA and form their own private statewide Christian association and stage their own playoffs. Now, we were once told that if you wanted to pray in school, you should go to a private Christian school. These students did, but now that they are there, this author would have them leave the league entirely. Well, where does it end? Must religious picnickers form their own private parks lest they be accused of violating the Constitution for saying grace over their meal at a public park? It was the FHSAA that engaged in religious discrimination against Cambridge Christian School. It would be an even greater offense to the Constitution's protection of religious liberty to force these students further from public participation. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. We'll take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention real quickly, we've got a couple of things on the website in addition to these articles. The first article about the Covington Catholic student story, and that one written by David French, and then also this one on the Supreme Court gun rights case. We'll talk about that with some of the callers I can see in just a minute. Third one is a very good piece that came out about the shutdown and way in which we could end the shutdown. And then another one, which I have mentioned earlier, but not on this particular hour, and that is, again, how the media, in many cases, is really failing us, because the 3 out of the 4 stories mentioned by Dan Crenshaw, if you're not familiar with him, of course, he is the representative from the 2nd Congressional District in Texas, an individual that was made fun of by Pete Davidson on Saturday Night Live because he has an eye patch. Of course, he was a Navy SEAL, but nevertheless, he made some really good arguments there as well. And so I thought that is the fourth article for you to find. And so all of it available at our website. In addition to one other thing, my commentary today is on fiscal preview. And my argument, based on some of the things Kevin Williamson said, is if you think it's bad now, in which we have 1/4 of the federal judiciary not receiving checks, imagine what could happen in the future if a Social Security recipient does not receive his or her check, or a mother in poverty does not receive funding for food stamps. And if we don't pay attention to the fiscal deficits and the national debt, someday the government will be out of work. And so that's why I said, in some respects, this could be a fiscal preview of what that would look like. Because even now, even though I have friends that are not receiving a paycheck, and this needs to be resolved, nevertheless, they know they will get a paycheck. But imagine when you don't get a check from the government because the government runs out of money. And so this is why we have to pay attention to some of those as well. Got all sorts of calls, so let's take those before we run out of time this hour. We'll go to Pete in the state of Texas. What's your point of view?
Oh, hello, sir. I was talking. Let me turn off the radio.
That would be helpful. Sir? Yes. Again, we do a delay. That's because every once in a while, not too often, some people say some naughty things. We have to bleep it out. So that's why we have a bit of a delay, and it just confuses you. So turn the radio off or down when you're on the program. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, hold on, sir. I'm sorry. Let me turn off the car because it has something to do with the car.
Okay, well, I will get to you in just a minute. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you ready?
Here. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. It's this thing with the Bluetooth, whatever. But no, I was talking to the guy. I was listening to you a while ago. And, yes, it caught my attention on both the abortion and the gun rights, where it doesn't make any sense on what you're saying and how did it get to the Supreme Court. Because if a criminal comes over, and you had every right to defend yourself, yet you don't have your gun and a criminal uses it against you, could even injure you or kill you, yet they seem to protect the criminal more, yet he's not going to obey the law, So, we righteous Americans want to do what we got to do. And they expect that. And also it's crazy on the abortion bit that, that God does forbid that. I mean, that this is life. You and I could have been aborted and we wouldn't have been here. I mean, you know what I mean? It's just a lot of crazy stuff.
Pete, you're using lots of common sense there, and there doesn't seem to be so much common sense sometimes inside some of these state capitals like Albany, New York, even our own Washington, D.C. capital. Seems to be a little more state capital wisdom there in the state of Texas where you are in Austin, especially since we've had some of these individuals on the program talking about it. But you're using common sense, and I guess that's part of the problem. Some people don't have a lot of common sense.
And, so it's crazy. Forgive me for saying all this about all this. And I don't disrespect anyone, but all this transgender and same-sex marriage and me wanting to be a man when I'm a woman, vice versa. And it's crazy.
Well, you've got some good points there, Pete, and I appreciate you calling in. I'll let you get back into your car and drive on, and I appreciate you calling in. I suspect maybe you were a first-time caller, and if you were, again, you can join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to South Carolina. And on the Good News Network, Stephen, I think you had a concealed carry class, and you can educate us a little bit, so go ahead.
Yeah, I just got my concealed weapons permit. I took the class in South Carolina. And the instructor made it very clear. He said, if you go to New Jersey or if you go to New York, don't have a gun on you, period. You'll go to jail. That's what he said. And that's how extreme they are in New Jersey and New York.
Oh, yeah. And let me just tell you, each summer, as some of our listeners know, I speak in upstate New York, usually at Camp of the Woods, sometimes a Word of Life. But my wife and I always love to go to Vermont. Now, here is so interesting because Vermont is right next to New York. In Vermont, even though Bernie Sanders is the senator, it is really a very good state for Second Amendment rights. I mean, if you live in Arizona, you live in Vermont, you go, wow. I mean, I have a lot of Second Amendment freedom. And so in some respects, it's really amazing. But then right over the line in New York, you limit it dramatically. Well, there used to be a sign which they finally took down and just put a little less intrusive sign. But the old sign used to, as you were driving from Vermont into New York, kind of saying, if you have a gun, you're in trouble, is basically what the sign said. And that is kind of the point, is that I even sometimes will go over to New York because there's a place where you can shoot shotgun and things like that. And I was showing some friends, I said, now look, the dairy farmers over here in Vermont, they can have any kind of weapon they want, and they can store them in their home, and they can have them in their barn. These dairy farmers just over this line here in New York, they can't do any of that. And so, Stephen, the bottom line is that even though we wish we would have reciprocity, that is, if you conceal carry in South Carolina, you could still have that right in New York. You probably want to make sure you do not have a weapon with you when you come into some of those states, because they're so very restrictive, aren't they?
They are. The only other comment I wanted to make is on the issue of Roe versus Wade and abortion. Since that law was passed, Roe versus Wade,
yes,
I think the number of aborted in the United States greater than 20 million abortions.
That's about 60 million, and it's greater than the population of Canada. Matter of fact, it exceeded the population of Canada some time ago. I'm trying to find another country that has a population equal to it. But yes, I mean, it's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's like you completely eliminated the entire country of Canada, and even that is a number that's a little too low now.
Well, the point that I want to make is we brought judgment on our own country because illegal aliens come here for work, and that workforce was eliminated by abortion.
Yep.
And
how about Social Security? It's going to be hard to eventually, I just talked about that a minute ago in my fiscal preview article. We've never required as few people to fund the retirement of so many, because you had a baby boom, then you had a baby bust, and a lot of that is due to not only declining fertility, various individuals wanted to have fewer children, but also the issue of abortion. So, Stephen, you're right on target. Just had to keep moving because we are going to take a break and then kind of change some topics. Now, some of you have already raised the issue of abortion, and we will get into that tomorrow. We'll see what Penna Dexter can educate us on in terms of that particular law that was passed in the state of New York. And, of course, my commentary on Tuesday was on the issue of abortion. Commentary Monday, by the way, is on Martin Luther King Jr. and on the Birmingham jail, the letter from the Birmingham jail. The one today, fiscal preview, which again is just a reminder, we have some major financial problems and fiscal problems in the future. And so the question I have is, if you think it's bad right now when 800,000 workers aren't receiving a paycheck and at least know later on they're going to get one, what happens when a number maybe 10 times as large doesn't receive a Social Security check or a payment for food stamps? And that's why we have to pay attention to some of our financial issues here in the government as well. Let's take a break. We are going to come back and talk a little bit about the Holocaust, which I think connects very much to some of the things we've been talking about here today. That comes up right after these important messages.
Question: do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to be talking about the Holocaust and actually getting a chance to hear from somebody that experienced it. Dr. Dirk van Leenen actually spent time as a child in a concentration camp. That actually took place in Belgium, and that happened obviously during World War II, before he was rescued by the British. He has an incredible story to tell, so we're going to have a chance to hear that. And the third book in the trilogy has come out. So we have all three books available now. We have a link to his website, dirkvanleenen.com. You don't have to even know how to spell it, because we have it there on the website. A Resistance on a Bicycle, The Americans Are Coming, and then the most recent one now coming out, The Last Train to the Concentration Camp. And he oftentimes speaks in schools, in churches, and other venues. You might want to even consider scheduling him to address this issue. And, of course, his book series is based upon his own experiences during the Holocaust. So, Dr. van Leenen, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Let's, if we can, kind of get into the story, and I may just want to step back for a few minutes, just let you tell your story, because it is incredible. You need to, of course, tell about your father and your own experience there and how you ended up in a concentration camp. So let me just step back and let you tell the story, which I know you've told to a number of church groups and other individuals about the Holocaust.
Yeah. My father was a Christian, and my mother was a Jew. And because of that, my father had a good heart for the Jewish people. He became the head of the resistance in The Hague during World War II. The Jewish people were hunted down in every town and every city, and particularly in The Hague, the city was totally closed off with roadblocks. Nobody could go out, curfew at 7. And so the Jewish people came to us, were hiding in our house, an average of 20 people. And then at night, in the curfew time, one resistance man with one Jew would come out every day, dozens, and bring those people to safe places outside the city. Mind you, the wartime was very severe at that time. Electricity was turned off, water was turned off, food was on stamps only that you had to get from the Nazis and you had to work for. And so life was horrible for children. And I was only 3 years when I started to experience that. My father had to deliver to the hiding places and organize the hiding places and find new ones every time, because throughout the 4 years of the war till the end, more than 5,000 people were in hiding on farms all across the country, and you couldn't get people there just, by car. There were no cars. They were all confiscated. So the only way was on a bicycle. And that caused my father to be branded by the Nazis at a certain time when they found out that he was in charge of all that, and they tried to catch him. That is all in the third book. The first book begins with how it all happened, how people coped with it, how dangerous it was for all, for even the hiders were punished. But it happened and it worked, and it was very severe. One day, the first time I was cognizant of it, I was only 3 years old, and the Nazis came into our house, burst into it with a group, and started searching the house. And as a little boy, I looked up at those soldiers with their uniforms and their guns, and I thought they were playing a game of hide and seek.
Wow.
And I thought I can help them a little. And my mother saw my hesitation and grabbed me, took me to another room, and said, "These people have bad intentions with our friends below, so never tell them." And I said, "But why?" And my mother said, "Because they are Jewish." And I said, "Why are they Jewish?" And she explained to me, and she said, "The Jewish people are God's chosen people, and we as Christians are having to take care of them, and that's why we do this." And that's how it began to form in my mind what was going on. Then my father had to go to all these hiding places and find the hiding places and find more hiding places and deliver IDs, because every Jew and every person in Holland received the German ID. And the non-Jews had a normal ID, but the Jewish people had a big red J on it for Jew. And if they showed their ID to a German, they were immediately arrested. So he had to deliver those fake IDs on his bicycle, but he was stopped at every roadblock and frisked and interrogated. And he took me on the bicycle, and I was packed with all the counterfeit stuff, and the Nazis never touched the child.
And that's smart.
And so later, when food became on stamps only, that meant every man had to work for the Nazis 4 hours a day. That's how they controlled the people, because they were scheduled to work at a certain time. And if they would not show up, they could be arrested and shipped to a work camp in Germany. So they controlled the people's time by those cards, but also their food distribution, because when they had committed their 4 hours per day for 7 days, they would receive a stamp book, which was, each stamp was good for a half a pound of butter or half a loaf of bread, and that's all you could buy with that stamp. So the Jewish people never got any stamps, of course. And again, the resistance printed those, and my father and I delivered those, and I carried the stamps, and I was the decoy of the operation. And sometimes when they got too nasty to my father, he'd put his hand on his cheek, and that was the sign for me to create a scene, and I was very good at bawling.
Let me take a break, and when we come back, I want to continue, because in some respects you're giving us a little bit of an overview of that first book in the trilogy, Resistance on a Bicycle. We come back, we're going to continue with Dr. Dirk van Leenen, and this is an opportunity for you to learn a little bit more about him. And if it sounds familiar, I suspect some of you that are older might remember both the book and the film of Corrie ten Boom, The Hiding Place, and in some respects this one gives you another perspective on that as well. But there are 3 books in the series, and again, we have a link to his website in case you'd like to read those books. Of course, we have a way in which you could order them if you'd like to do so. Resistance on a Bicycle, The Americans Are Coming, and the most recent one just came out, The Last Train to the Concentration Camp. We'll get to that one as well. Also, we'll talk about how he ended up in the concentration camp, how his family was treated, and, of course, the rescue. So we have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
I believe the latest government shutdown has been a fiscal preview of financial problems that will hit the government and us in the next few years. I'm not the only one saying this. Kevin Williamson, in a recent column, says the shutdown could be a dress rehearsal for a fiscal Armageddon. Each day we see news reports of government bureaucrats who've had to scale back their spending because they aren't receiving a paycheck. There was even one story about a couple that took back their Christmas presents. But we all know that when the shutdown is over, government employees will receive back pay. These news reports are focusing on what happens when thousands of federal workers don't get their paychecks. Imagine what our society would look like when millions of citizens stop getting checks because the government has run out of money. We aren't there yet, but we're headed there quickly. Total spending on the major entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, will eventually exceed all the federal tax revenue collected each year, and at the same time, the national debt continues to grow. And as interest rates increase, the cost of servicing the debt will go up even if the national debt did not increase. In the best of all worlds, we would hope that our newly elected members of Congress would be willing to address this growing fiscal crisis. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the slightest interest from congressional leaders to reform our long-term fiscal issues. It's easier to ignore the potential problem or postpone any meaningful reform. The next time you see a story about federal workers not getting paychecks, look at the frustration on their faces and multiply it tenfold in order to see what will happen when grandma doesn't get her Social Security check or an impoverished mother doesn't get her welfare payment. That will be a social and economic crisis we have never seen in our lifetimes. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Sky Pass Entertainment, The Least of These, The Graham Stain Story. The Least of These, rated PG-13, in theaters February 1st. TheLeastOfThese.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Dirk van Leenen with us as we are talking today about the three-book series. It's a trilogy: Resistance on a Bicycle, The Americans Are Coming, and The Last Train to the Concentration Camp, which also gives you some of the memories of this small boy and even the attempt by the Nazi German general that, even though he knows the war is lost, still is trying to defeat the resistance. And before we move on to the second book, are there any other things we might want to mention from Resistance on a Bicycle? Because as you pointed out, this was an opportunity for you to, first of all, provide these false IDs and these various pamphlets and other kinds of things that were necessary, because if you were Jewish and you were caught as Jewish, you were going to get shipped off. And, of course, there was no way for you to buy food. So anybody involved in the resistance, as your father was, and you were indirectly, had to do quite a number of things and always stay one step ahead of the Nazi officials.
And that was the biggest challenge. And my second book begins with an event that happened on September 12, 1944, 8 months before the end of the war.
Right.
2,000 Canadian paratroopers landed in Holland, and they had to find a place or make a space for the Allied troops to come in. However, they came with handguns and rifles and had to fight against machine guns, cannons, and tanks. And they lost 1,000 men. But that day was called Frenzy Tuesday because the people went into a frenzy, dancing in the streets, carrying orange for the House of Orange, and yelling, we're liberated. But that was a false impression. And after 10 days, the soldiers began to shoot at the people on the street, and they had to get back inside. The second book has all kinds of similar stories about what happened when the end of the war was nearing. In the city of Arnhem, where the Canadians landed, the Nazis settled down, taking all the houses from the people, just letting people go out on the street, and you saw long lines of refugees finding a place to stay and sleep and eat. And the Nazis took all their houses. Those stories are in the second book, and the reason why it's called The Americans Are Coming is when something bad happens, the Dutch people would sigh and say, but the Americans are coming. And that's where the title comes from. But every book has more than 50 chapters, and each chapter is a separate story, separate incident, which connects my family together. There was one, now we come to book number 3, because that's a very, very important lesson. It was one Nazi captain, a crazy man who thought that if he could get one more load of Jews to a concentration camp, he would be promoted to general or something. He was so motivated that he chartered 2 trucks and 20 soldiers and binoculars, and they set out a trap for my father. The trap was that he had to be caught in the midst of a hiding place with a lot of Jews in it. Well, my father went on his way with a colleague to the middle of the Netherlands, where there were dozens of hiding places, and he was there to warn the people not to think that the liberation had come. Make sure to keep silent and keep hiding, because the danger becomes bigger. And while he was doing that, he was followed by those trucks half a mile behind him, so he had no idea he was followed. But every time he went into a farm, he found out later that the Nazis had visited that farm, and most of the time they could not find any Jews because the hiding places were very clever. But finally, after a few days of being followed and all kinds of incidents, the group of 72 Jews were moved from place to place. And the last place was a very far in the land, in the meadows, barn, old dilapidated barn surrounded by trees, and they brought them there. And meanwhile, my father and his colleague put their bicycles by the front door of the farm, and then the trucks rolled in. And my father and colleague saw him coming, and they fled behind the barn, but they followed them, and they tried to catch him, and my father found a dung cellar and dove into that, and they were hiding there until the trucks left again. But they saw across from the farm that the grass was all trampled, and they said, oh, but there must be people there. And they followed that path and found the farm and found the 72 Jews, loaded them up, and then they came back to the farm. And my father was in the dung cellar, and he heard the trucks leave, but they left some soldiers there without the trucks. So, because they said they got to come out back to their bicycles. And then they were arrested. Finally, out of the dung, they wanted to wash each other off in the stable, and suddenly they were surrounded by the Nazis. Then they were taken to a jail, and the people were sent to a holding place, and there are all details of that in my book, how that worked. But my father and his colleague were tortured for 5 days, severely tortured. So bad that my father later, years later, told me they could have killed me. I would have let them because I was never going to give any hiding place away. Then they sent for my mother, and my mother took me with her, and we came to the jail, and my mother had to clean up my father. Hours of cleaning up, bandaging, giving him fresh clothes, and when he finally was merely standing, my mother said, well, we are ready to go home. And the soldier said, no, ma'am, you're going on the train tonight. And that's how my mother, my father, and me, and 72 Jews, and more others that they had arrested, a total of over 200 people were stuffed into a cattle car. This cattle car could normally hold 20 cows, and now there were 200 people pushed into it. And the train started going, but it was the last month of the war, and most concentration camps had been closed. In Holland, there was a holding camp in Bergen-Belsen, not Bergen-Belsen, in Holland, Westerbork, but halfway down, the train was stopped, and they had to turn around because that camp was closed. The train was on the way for 4 days and 4 nights without any food, without any water, without a bathroom, without even being able to move your arms. And you can imagine how these people coped with that and the smell in it, and horrifying. Finally, after the 4 days and 4 nights, we entered Bergen-Belsen, and that is below Hamburg, and that was the only camp still open.
Yes.
And in that camp were 60,000 people, and 2 of them was Anne Frank and her sister.
Wow.
And that's where Anne Frank died of typhus, because the Nazis did not have any food for the people in the last 3 months of the war. And this was the last weeks of the war, 2 weeks or so. And so people were walking around like skeletons with a skin over it and dropping dead everywhere. And the Nazis simply grabbed the bodies and threw them on a big heap. And everywhere were big heaps of dead bodies. That made a huge impression on me. Now I can talk about it, but for the longest time I couldn't.
Let me jump in real quickly because we have a mandatory break, and we'll talk a little bit more about that concentration camp and, again, some of the incredible things in that third book, The Last Train to the Concentration Camp. We are privileged to have with us today Dr. Dirk van Leenen, and when we come back, we'll continue our story and then also give you a chance, if you have a comment or a question, to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to read the 3 books, we have information about that. We have a link to his website, and all of it's available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Question: do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less, and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Dirk van Leenen. And again, the books are entitled Resistance on a Bicycle, The Americans Are Coming. And we're spending most of our time now talking about the last train to the concentration camp. I might just mention, Dr. van Leenen, just for a second, this is usually a time in which we encourage people to go to your website. And again, it is available on our website, and they can find the books there. But I know that oftentimes you are available to come and to speak and to share some of these stories. So tell us, if indeed, how somebody might be able to contact you and what you might be able to be involved in.
Yes, they can leave it on my website, the request, and then I call them and I tell them or check them with the date and so on. I've just been to Pella, Iowa, and I did 7 talks in that town, and thousands of people came. I went to Orange City as well a week or 2 later, and we had just great talks there too, 7 talks. And so usually when somebody calls from a certain town, I approach other places like churches and colleges, and then I can come and carry the expenses for it.
So again, that's just something that is also available. But let's get back to your story for just a few more minutes. Making your way to that concentration camp in Belgium, which is...
it was in, not Belgium, it was Bergen-Belsen, and that's in Germany.
Yeah, okay. But nevertheless, I mean, it's a good illustration of the fact that Anne Frank was there. You were, again, at the very tail end of the war. And if it weren't for this captain who was trying to make general, who was just fanatical about tracking you down, probably would never have happened. And as I understand, during the war, almost, 10,000 Jews were hidden throughout the Netherlands. Is that true?
Yes, yes. And hardly any came back out of the camps. And before the war, there were more than 50,000 Jews in Holland. So the casualties were great, were large, but still we were able to save lives. Similar chapters like my father did were happening in other cities. And so it wasn't only my father, of course. He was in charge in the city of The Hague. Anyway, we were in that camp, and there was no food, and there was only one pump with water. And there's a picture in my book of a mountain of shoes and people sitting on that mountain, pulling off the leather soles and soaking them to eat.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was so severe that. But anyway, the British Army came and liberated the camp. And that was a glorious sight because thousands of trucks and thousands of soldiers, tanks and trucks with food were coming in. Unfortunately, half the people in the camp could not eat anymore. Mm-hmm. The insides were dried up and they're dying. So the medics did a lot of things, but 30,000 of the people in the camp died after the liberation because of that lack of food. That was horrifying. But anyway, we had to register to the British Army officers, and they were setting up a table in front of every barrack, and my father, mother, and me had to stand in front of the table and tell them how long we were there and where we came from and so on, and then a miracle happened. My father in The Hague during the war had to go to a radio transmitter every day at 8 o'clock at night in a bombed out building, and there he was contacted with the British Army, and the British Army would report that to the Dutch government in London. And when every night he spoke to the same British officer. And now we were standing in front of a British officer, and my father gave his name, and the officer said, "Are you the Kees van Rijn?" That was my father's code name, or from The Hague. And my father said, "Yes, how do you know that?" And the officer said, "We've been talking to each other for the past 3 years, and I could not get a hold of you anymore in the last few weeks. Now I know where you are." And he said, "You need to get back to Holland immediately. You're needed there." So the truck, we were put on a truck with food and clothes, and we were on our way. But everywhere were battle lines. It was the last weeks of the war, and the truck could not go where he wanted to go, and we ended up in Belgium. There, we contacted the resistance, and they helped us for some days, and they said, "You cannot go into Holland. Holland is not liberated yet. The Allied armies and navies are waiting in the North Sea. The other part is in Luxembourg, waiting to get into Holland. So the security from the Nazis is extra strong, and if you go traveling in Holland, you get arrested." So after some days, they came back to resistance and said, "We can get you across the river behind the Navy, and then you're on your own. Do you want to do that?" And my father said, "Absolutely." And so we were brought into Holland, but there the resistance again said, "You can't go traveling like this." My father said, "Is there a way?" And they gave him a bakfiets, that's a box bicycle, where my mother and I could sit in the box, and my father would pedal the bicycle, and we had to cross 5 different wide rivers to come to The Hague. But they said, "You cannot go as a man. Men are all arrested immediately." So they made my father into a woman, and they said, "Well, 2 crazy women on a box bicycle, they won't stop." And it was true. In fact, we got back to The Hague finally, and we found our house completely ransacked. There were a large number, and it was all explained in the book. A large number of traitors in Holland. Right. Because when Hitler started in Germany, he started the National Socialistic Party, which means Nazi. And beware of those words here. Now, then the Nazis came to every country around Germany and started a National Socialistic Party. And when they came and took over the country, they went to all these members of the National Socialistic Party, and they said, "Now you need to help us to make our ideal of National Socialism work." And the people did it, and they became traitors. They were paid, sometimes paid with food, sometimes with other privileges. And so they had ransacked our house. We could not live in it, and it took us 6 months. And 5 days after we arrived back in The Hague at our house, the war was ended. And that was on May 5th, 1945. My book has a lot of information, all books, on the facts of the war, what was behind it, why the Jews, why National Socialism, and so on. It's a huge, good teaching for children. That's why I do talks in high schools and at colleges. And I tell people that buy my books, by all means, give them to your children and your grandchildren, because they need to know this. History is repeating itself.
And I want to take a break, and when we come back, I want to get your comments about that, because I suspect that you have some concerns about whether history has been repeating itself in different places around the world. So we'll talk about that. And so let's take a break, and we'll come back and we'll answer that question about Do we see any examples of this today in our world? If you have just joined us, of course, we've been talking with Dr. Dirk van Leenen, and you can see a lot more about him at our website, pointofview.net. It will take you to dirkvanleenen.com, and in there you can find the books, for example, Resistance on a Bicycle, The Americans Are Coming, and, of course, the book we've just been talking about, The Last Train to the Concentration Camp. We've talked about Nazi occupation. We've talked about the concentration camp. We've talked about the British and the Americans and others. But most importantly, I want to come back and talk about, is history repeating itself? A very good question, and I know something that Dirk van Leenen has some comments about as well. So let's take a break. We will come back right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. An editorial penned in the Tampa Bay Times has called for one of our clients to form a league of their own. The author writes about Cambridge Christian School, who earned the chance to play for a state football championship game against another Christian school. Both teams asked the Florida High School Athletic Association to pray over the public address system prior to kickoff. That request was denied by the FHSAA, specifically because the requested speech was religious in nature. The author supports the FHSAA. He writes, if Cambridge and similar schools want public community prayer before their state championship games, they should leave the FHSAA and form their own private statewide Christian association and stage their own playoffs. Now, we were once told that if you wanted to pray in school, you should go to a private Christian school. These students did, but now that they are there, this author would have them leave the league entirely. Well, where does it end? Must religious picnickers form their own private parks lest they be accused of violating the Constitution for saying grace over their meal at a public park? It was the FHSAA that engaged in religious discrimination against Cambridge Christian School. It would be an even greater offense to the Constitution's protection of religious liberty to force these students further from public participation. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dirk van Leenen. And again, this is a series of books, a trilogy, Resistance on a Bicycle, The Americans Are Coming, and The Last Train to the Concentration Camp. But I thought the obvious question for you, Dr. van Leenen, is do you see history repeating itself? And you've sort of already told us that you do. So tell us where you see that.
Well, first of all, you can see an increase in anti-Semitism. You saw that in the shooting at the church, at the synagogue just recently. you hear about anti-Semitism. There is a chapter of neo-Nazis in every state with thousands of members. And what they are preaching is National Socialism. And I don't want to get political, but we have certain people in the political arena who are also saying National Socialism. That is the word where Nazi comes from. That is going on. Then Iran is openly saying we're driving all the Jews into the sea out of Israel. And then we have Kim Jong-un in Korea who has a dozen concentration camps in the south, very unknown, in the south with millions of North Koreans who are not able to participate in normal life, and if they get sick and cannot work, they're simply shot. That is another Holocaust. It goes on and on because Hitler was 1 year away from the atomic bomb, and Kim Jong-un is threatening with that too. And so there are many reasons. You can see it daily. Hatred, lies, misinformation by the press and by people in general in politics. And so history is repeating itself, and if people read my books, they will realize and recognize this history. They will see what's happening in this country and what we can do about it.
Let's say we can talk for just a minute about the experiences that you've had, because I suspect that when you speak to especially younger audiences, they are unaware of this. You would say so often, never forget. And I have been to virtually all of the Holocaust museums. We have one here in Dallas. I've been to the one in Washington, D.C. Of course, I've been to the one in Israel. But I also recognize that for a lot of people, maybe even hearing this program today is kind of new information. And what has been your experience as you've had a chance to share this with the next generation?
I am getting audiences that are in awe of the facts that I tell them, facts that are unknown. Facts, for instance, it took almost 2.5 years for the world to find out that people were being murdered in those concentration camps. What was behind it that people would get a letter from the Nazis saying you have to be at the train station on that and that day and that at that time, you can only bring that and that with you. What was the motivation behind that? It's all in my books, and it's very interesting that what was going on was so prepared by the Nazis long before they began the war. They set up a Jewish council in every country, promising them leadership over the Jews. The Jewish people would get a letter from the Jewish council saying, if you get a letter from the Nazis, obey it, do what they say, that will save your life. Lies and deception was rampant in it, and awkward planning long beforehand. And you wonder what is being planned right now in this country by the neo-Nazis or by the anti-Semites or by just simple people that preach socialism and socialistic methods and ways of life. So I get children. I did a talk in several colleges and several places in the Pella area in Iowa and here in Arizona, and the teachers warn me for the crowd, and I keep them silent for the whole hour, and in awe of what they get to hear. And then they come afterwards, they come to me and want to hug me and shake hands. Children. It's great.
Well, again, if people would like to schedule you or get to know you better, we have a link to your website. You do have an email address and a phone address. People that have been watching this online also can find the Facebook posts and other things so they can follow you as well. We have both your Twitter account as well as your Facebook account, so people can follow that. And if they find themselves saying, I'd like to know a little bit more, I'd like to maybe have you come and speak in an event, or I'd like to get copies of these books and pass them on to others, all of that is available at our website. Just before I let you go, any final words to our listeners? We certainly do appreciate you taking the time to spend an hour with us and to share your story.
I have one mention, and that is these books are not at Amazon.com or in the bookstores yet. I sell them direct to people, and they get signed copies. And I sell them for a special price, about $30 less than the bookstores are going to sell them for.
Well, again, I appreciate you sharing all that with us today. And if nothing else, we do need to, in a world which seems to have a growing animosity towards the Jewish race, in the midst of anti-Semitism and the rise sometimes of neo-Nazism, and even in the people that will label everyone as Hitler or fascist or Nazis, to really understand what the true experience is, and also in a culture that sometimes has Holocaust deniers and all the rest. I just felt that your series of books would just be a great antidote to that, and so I really appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View, so thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kerby. Very, very nice.
If you'd like more information, we have all of that available at our website, pointofview.net, and so you can go and find his website, which, again, some of you might say, well, how do you spell his name? The good news is just go to pointofview.net. You click on his picture. It'll take you to the website. That will give you all the contact information you might want, also the books that you, I suspect, will want to read. And so those materials are available to you as well. Of course, the other articles we've posted today are there, and my commentary today is available. So take the time to click on the commentary and maybe read that. If you'd like to sign up, of course, as I've said so many times before, you can receive not only my commentary Monday through Friday in your inbox. We also send you Penedextras on Saturdays, so you can 6 days a week receive some of the Viewpoints commentaries. They're available to you as well. We have some take action items there for you, as well as videos and a variety of other things. So take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. While you go there, I hope you'll also consider what you might do to support this ministry. We are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you. So if you can take the time to click on that button, that would be an opportunity for you to support this ministry. And more importantly, some of you might say, this was really good. I know some people I'd like to hear this. And so how can I send that to them? Go to the website where, again, we give you an opportunity to donate. Next to it is one that says watch or listen. So you can watch the program again, or you can just simply go to the YouTube channel and watch it, or listen and download the podcast and send it to others. This is a story that needs to get out. And that's why we took an entire hour today to educate you about it. Hope you appreciated the conversation. I certainly did. I think we all learned something. It was a sobering reminder of evil in the world and why we need to stand for truth. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow.
From Sky Pass Entertainment comes The Least of These, the Graham Stain story. When speculation mounts that a local missionary is converting locals to Christianity in India, a journalist must choose between his own ambition and the truth.
We can't make any mistakes. They have this law for a reason.
I know. We must pray.
Based on the true story. The Least of These, the Graham Stain story, rated PG-13, may be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters February 1st. More information is available at theleastofthese.movie.
Jesus said you could find a person's heart by where they invest their money. We at Point of View could not be more thankful that so many demonstrate a love for truth and for this nation by investing in our common mission. Of course, the reality is our team, our truth team, is a small percentage of those who listen. And right now, as they say in sports, we could use a deeper bench. For those who have given, thank you. And if you haven't made that step yet, take one now. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Show your heart for our future. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.